Hello and welcome to this Blackwell online podcast. My name is George Miller, and my guest today is painter, designer and writer Matthew Rice, author of the eponymous Rice's Architectural Primer, a quirky, entertaining and beautifully illustrated introduction to architecture for those of us who need help telling a pediment from a tympanum. Matthew introduces the grammar and vocabulary of architecture in the most painless way. I asked him if he was worried about most of us being illiterate when it came to speaking the language of architecture.
Yeah, I think that there's a danger of illiteracy in all sorts of fields. I am scientifically very illiterate. I'm mechanically very illiterate. I think that, because there's so much knowledge to get your head around now, we are all inclined to be quite illiterate about quite a lot of things. And so any way of doing some very, very basic literacy training for any of those areas is bound to make one's. I don't think you enjoy things if you can't talk about them.
And how far back does your own interest in architecture go?
I've always been interested in it. My father dragged me around churches when I was a child. I became more interested in it at school, and I think it's just always been something that I find very gripping. I was thinking about it last night, funnily enough, staying in a Landmark Trust railway station at Alton Towers. And opposite the road from this was one of the lodges to Alton Towers, designed by Pugin. And I had last year read that very good book about Pugin. And I looked at it and I thought one of the extraordinary things about architecture as opposed to building is that it does crystallize people's ideas. It's a complete resolution. And the idea that you can actually look at somebody's complete resolution more or less unchanged 100 or 200 or 300 or 500 years later, I think is a really exciting idea. And I think that's probably one of the things I find most exciting about it.
Now, as we've said, you want to introduce people to the names of parts of buildings. That's one of the motives, to show people that there is a language of architecture and it's made up of vocabulary. How would you then like them to use that knowledge in order to be synthesized into something greater than the naming of the parts?
I think that, at the risk of being prescriptive, I think that would risk being prescriptive, and I think only that if you are interested or might become interested, then vocabulary is what you need. I think that what one hopes is then when someone is reading a description of a building or talking to someone else about it, they, you've got the weaponry to do that with. You've got the equipment to do it. This book is very much not. It isn't a polemic. It doesn't have a particular line on anything, nor need it do. And it's far from erudite on any other subjects it's dealing with. It does have a little bit of background on each period, because I think that without that, it's very hard to make head or tail of any of it. And I also think that some kind of historical note is useful, because for some people it'll be the only book they're reading about architecture, so you might as well get down a few salient points and put them over. But I think the idea is to say that in an overall interest or an incipient interest, then this is just there to give you a bit of basic knowledge.
One characteristic of the book is that it's extremely reader-friendly and inviting and visually immediate. And I wondered if you thought that, previous writing in architecture, thinking of someone like Sir Nicholas Pevsner, which is an incredible project and admirable in many ways, but it is also rather daunting. And if in a way people have been scared off architecture because they feel they do have to have more specialist knowledge than they can readily acquire in order to talk about it with some understanding.
Yes, Pevsner's Buildings of Britain is extraordinary, and it's a reference work. This is a primer, not a reference work. And I think there's an inclination to assume things. Pevsner specifically does assume a knowledge, although all the volumes do have a glossary in them. It's a relatively dry piece of equipment. He did bring a very scientific approach to the study of architecture. I've not got a very scientific approach to it. I've also, been doing this, looked at, several other glossaries over the decades. And there is an inclination to dryness. There's also an inclination either to using photographs, which we could talk about in a second because I think that they have a problem, but also using source material. And source material is obviously wonderful, but I think it distracts. I think it's an issue of its own. And I think that if you have a lot of differing source material, starting with 16th century engravings and going on to 18th century drawings and then tackling 19th century watercolor drawings, all that kind of thing, it does make a beautiful book, but I think it adds another layer into the difficulty of learning. And so I have tried, in the way I've illustrated the book, I definitely have tried to be accessible, as you say, but I've tried to make the illustrations particularly accessible. And one of the ways I've made them accessible is by them having a relatively schematic approach and having one common style from start to finish. So the whole book reads as one document. And I think that does make the learning a bit easier. I think that whereas chopping from idea to idea visually is probably a blockage, a potential blockage.
The book is very, very coherent in its visual style. And I wondered, when you set about approaching each period, how did you boil it down, as it were? Because you're trying to communicate the essences rather than do illustrations of particular buildings in very fine detail. You're trying to extract some kind of essence.
Yes. No. I think what I've tried to do is to go for the characteristics of each period. And obviously there are common characteristics to 3 or 4 periods, or all periods. There are windows in everything, there are bays, there are stories, there are all sorts of things that run all the way through. I've tried to find the things that characterize that period and then explain them. So each period probably emphasizes the things that are particular to it, while not abandoning the bits that are general. But I suppose that's how I've really tackled what I've featured each time. And again, in the writing of each chapter, I've tried not to give a full and detailed description of the architectural events of the age, but rather to pick out highlights and specific characters or features that do characterize the age, as opposed to completely explaining it.